Rain fell with the patience of judgment upon the stone steps of St. Aldwyn's Hall, turning candlelight into trembling gold and silk hems into burdens. Inside, charity unfolded beneath chandeliers like a ritual of mercy performed for witnesses, not for the poor. Voices glided as softly as gloves across marble, each syllable polished, each smile measured. It was here that Eleanor Hale learned how loudly shame could whisper. She stood at the edge of the room, hands folded as if prayer might disguise need, her gown plain to the point of invisibility, her posture composed by habit rather than comfort. When she moved, eyes followed, not with interest, but with accounting. They knew her story, or believed they did. A woman without lineage was a ledger with missing columns. Society filled the gaps with conjecture. "Respectable, but unfortunate," said one lady with a sigh practiced in mirrors. "Clever, I hear, though imprudence often masquerades as wit," murmured another, lips curved in charitable disdain. Eleanor received their glances as one receives rain, without protest, without shelter. Dignity, she had learned, was not a shield but a stance. It did not stop the fall. It determined how one stood beneath it. A clerk approached with a list and a hesitation. "Miss Hale," he said, and the pause after her name was the cruelty. The pause invited listeners. The pause invited memory. Eleanor inclined her head. She knew what came next, the withdrawal of an invitation, the quiet correction of a seating plan, the small public subtraction that felt like erasure. When it arrived, it did not surprise her. What surprised her was the heat behind her eyes, the rebellion of a body that refused to be as composed as her mind. She breathed. She thanked him. She turned away before the room could see her decide not to break. Somewhere near the dais, laughter rose, a delicate chiming that marked approval. Power resided there, where titles gathered like armor and alliances shimmered like jewels. Above them all moved a figure whose presence bent the room into attention without effort. He had not yet spoken, yet the air adjusted to receive him. The Duke of Ravenshollow was introduced in fragments before he appeared fully. The breadth of his estates, the gravity of his counsel, the engagement that crowned him safe and unreachable. Engaged to a princess, they said, with satisfaction that order had been preserved. Hunted by enemies, they whispered, with relish that danger made a finer story. Eleanor did not look for him. Looking invited hope, and hope was a habit she had disciplined from herself. Still, the room had its own currents, and she felt the subtle shift as he approached the edge of the crowd. The Duke's presence was not loud. It was precise. Dark cloth fell from his shoulders like certainty, and his expression bore the restraint of a man long practiced in withholding. When he spoke to others, his voice carried the calm authority of decisions already made. When he listened, it was with a stillness that unnerved. He was a man to whom rooms yielded. The humiliation returned, sharpened by proximity. A matron's hand rested on Eleanor's sleeve, guiding her away from a cluster of velvet chairs as if steering a piece of furniture. "Perhaps you would be more comfortable near the anteroom," she said kindly, which was to say, conclusively. Eleanor smiled, a courtesy that cost her breath, and obeyed. As she stepped back, her heel caught. The slip was small, the kind that would have passed unnoticed in a kinderroom, but here it bloomed into significance. A ripple moved through the watchers. Pity is louder than laughter. She steadied herself without assistance. That, too, was noted. What Eleanor did not know was that another steadiness had broken. From across the floor, the Duke's gaze had lifted unplanned, and found her in the moment between fall and recovery. He saw not the misstep but the resolve that followed it, the quiet ferocity of a woman who refused to be helped into lesser space. Something in his attention tightened, like a thread drawn too far. He did not smile. He did not look away. He observed her as one observes a landscape that promises both refuge and peril. For Eleanor, his regard was not salvation, it was exposure. To be seen by him was to step into the line of fire, and she understood this with a clarity born of long practice in self-preservation. Yet the warmth of being regarded without condescension unsettled her more than the cold of neglect ever had. She felt her carefully maintained distance falter, a fault line opening beneath her composure. Around them, the machinery of society continued to turn. Servants passed with trays, donors discussed generosity as if it were an investment, names rose and fell like tides. The anteroom, for a moment, belonged to them alone. Eleanor's pulse found its measure again. She straightened, not to impress, but to remember herself. If she spoke, she would speak as she always had, plainly, precisely, without plea. Whatever this attention meant, it would not purchase her dignity. That, at least, remained hers to keep. The room resumed its music. The charity continued. Eleanor reached the anteroom, where a window opened to the rain. She pressed her gloved hand to the glass and allowed herself a single, treacherous thought, that endurance might someday be witnessed without being weighed. Behind her, footsteps paused. A presence settled into the space as decisively as a held breath. When he spoke, it was not to console or command. "You need not apologize to the weather," the Duke said, his voice low, composed, unmistakable. Eleanor turned. In his eyes, she found neither pity nor curiosity, but recognition, an acknowledgment that did not ask her to diminish herself. The rain struck harder. Somewhere in the hall, a princess waited, and enemies counted. Eleanor met the Duke's gaze, unaware that the moment would be remembered as the instant everything began to tip. The morning after the charity, London woke to its favorite occupation, interpretation. Carriages rolled through damp streets carrying speculation wrapped in velvet, and drawing-rooms warmed themselves on yesterday's glances. Eleanor Hale did not hear the whispers directly. She felt them instead, like a change in pressure before a storm. At the small desk where she copied correspondence for a widow who paid her sparingly and judged her generously, she sensed her name being weighed elsewhere. She wrote carefully, each letter precise, as though order on the page might keep disorder from her life. By noon, the first token arrived. It was not grand enough to be insulting, nor modest enough to be invisible. A folded shawl, dove-gray and finely woven, delivered by a footman who offered no name and asked no thanks. Eleanor held the cloth as one might hold a question. She knew quality. She knew intention. To accept would be to step closer to a line she had spent years skirting. To refuse would be to refuse warmth in a city that punished pride as readily as want. She placed it across her shoulders and felt the immediate, treacherous comfort of being considered. The Duke of Ravenshollow did not announce his kindness. He concealed it in utility. That afternoon, a position opened at the circulating library, temporary but respectable, its origin attributed to chance. Eleanor recognized design where others saw fortune. She took the work and carried herself into it with measured gratitude, aware that gratitude could become a leash if worn too tightly. When she passed the library's tall windows, she sometimes sensed a gaze that did not intrude yet did not withdraw. It steadied her and unsettled her in equal measure. London noticed. It always did. A lady with nothing does not acquire warmth and work without explanation, and explanations tend to sharpen into accusation. Tea tables hummed. The word interest was spoken with a smile thin as paper. Eleanor's name was set beside the Duke's with a deliberateness that pretended to be coincidence. Someone recalled his engagement with a princess, as if invoking a talisman against disorder. Someone else mentioned his enemies, with the relish of a forecast that promised rain. At a concert given for a cause that could not fail because it served itself, Eleanor took a seat at the edge, the shawl folded neatly on her lap. The hall was lit like a jewel box, and sound rose in disciplined waves. She listened with care, determined to be no more remarkable than her chair. During the interval, a murmur passed through the rows, and she felt the now familiar shift as the Duke arrived. He did not seek her. He placed himself where he could see the stage and be seen by those who mattered. Yet when the music resumed, a small parcel appeared beside her glove, placed without ceremony, containing a program marked with a single line of ink. It circled a passage the orchestra would not play. Her breath caught. It was a confidence offered without demand. She folded the paper and returned her attention to the stage, aware that she had been invited into a private language. When applause broke, she stood with the rest and felt the eyes return, sharper now. A woman leaned close and spoke softly, as if sharing sympathy. "One must be careful, Miss Hale," she said, kindness sharpened to a blade. "Attention can be misinterpreted." Eleanor inclined her head, acknowledging the warning without accepting its premise. The princess arrived 2 days later, and the city exhaled. She moved through rooms with the serenity of someone whose worth had never been questioned. Pale silk, a measured smile, an assurance that required no reinforcement. When she spoke of duty, it sounded like belief. When she looked at the Duke, it was with possession softened into expectation. Eleanor observed from a distance, and distance felt suddenly inadequate. The tokens that had warmed her shoulders and steadied her days cooled in her hands. She saw the architecture of power and understood the cost of proximity. Enemies tested the air. A note was delivered to the library, unsigned, suggesting impropriety where there had been only restraint. It implied advancement purchased by favor, virtue exchanged for position. Eleanor read it once and burned it, the paper curling like a confession that would not be made. She did not tell the Duke. Silence, she believed, was the last form of control she possessed. That night, the shawl lay untouched, its comfort transformed into evidence. The Duke learned anyway. He learned as men in his position learned most things, through channels designed to protect him by exposing others. He did not rage. He adjusted. A carriage slowed at a crossing when Eleanor stood uncertain in the rain. A glance was offered and withdrawn. He spoke to her once, briefly, in the presence of others, his words formal and unremarkable. "Miss Hale," he said, with the emphasis of equal address. The effect was immediate. The room recalibrated. Respect is contagious when worn by those authorized to define it. Yet restraint has its own provocations. By evening, the whispers had grown teeth. A pamphlet appeared, cheaply printed, naming no one and indicting many, its insinuations precise enough to wound. Eleanor read a line and felt the ground shift. She folded the page with steady hands and chose movement over despair. If scandal was to be her companion, it would not find her passive. At dusk, she returned a token. The shawl, folded and immaculate, sent back without note. The messenger hesitated, then obeyed. Eleanor stood at her window and watched the lamps bloom in the fog, her chest tight with a grief she refused to name. Somewhere, a princess rehearsed certainty, and enemies sharpened their patience. When the Duke received the shawl, he did not send it again. He closed his hand around the cloth and understood that the city had crossed a line. The scandal had begun, and it would not be ended by silence. Fog pressed its pale hand against the windows of the Duke's townhouse, blurring the lamps into halos and the street into rumor. Eleanor stood just inside the threshold of the library, where firelight breathed across spines and brass, and felt the precariousness of permission. She had come because silence had failed her, because restraint had begun to look like surrender. The footman withdrew, the door closed, and the room gathered itself around two people who had learned to speak by not speaking. Ravenshollow waited near the hearth, his posture unassailable, his face composed into the neutrality that had steadied cabinets and quelled riots. He inclined his head, not as a superior but as an equal acknowledging a fact. "Miss Hale," he said, and her name carried the gravity of intention. She returned the courtesy with care, aware that courtesy could be armor or invitation. The fire ticked. "I returned the shawl," Eleanor began, "because beginnings must be chosen before courage can reconsider. Not as ingratitude, as necessity." Her voice held, though her hands did not. She folded them together and anchored herself to the words. "I cannot afford to be mistaken." "I did not mistake you," he replied, softly enough that the sentence felt like a trust. He did not step closer. He understood the geometry of threat. "Nor did I offer charity. I offered use." At her glance, he continued, "Use is honest. It implies nothing beyond itself." "Use becomes implication when it acquires witnesses," she said, the line sharpened by weeks of listening. "I have lived too long under interpretation to pretend otherwise." She met his eyes and found them steady, unflinching. "Your engagement is a fact the city enjoys repeating to me." "It is a fact I live with," he said. The words were measured, but the fire betrayed him, throwing quick light across his cheek. "It is also a structure built for reasons that have nothing to do with affection." He paused, then added, "I would not insult you by pretending it is weightless." She drew a breath that tasted of smoke and paper. "Your enemies have discovered me," she said, and the room seemed to tilt. They write as if they know me. They promise what they cannot give and threaten what they cannot take. She lifted her chin. I will not be used to wound you. You already have been, he said, not accusing, merely exact. And so have I. He moved then, not toward her, but to the desk, stopping as if the distance itself were a lesson. Eleanor watched him, aware that the distance between them had become deliberate, a line drawn by mutual regard. I am not brave, she said, surprised by the admission. I am careful. There is a difference. There is, he agreed. And yet careful people sometimes do the boldest things, because they understand the price. He faced her again. Tell me what you fear most. The question landed without ceremony. She considered evasion, found it wanting, and chose precision. I fear becoming a story told to justify someone else's certainty, she said. I fear that whatever is tender in me will be repurposed as proof of my inadequacy. She hesitated. I fear that being seen by you will cost me the last of my anonymity. He listened as if her words were instructions. When he spoke, it was with a restraint that had learned its own power. I fear the opposite, he said, that I have lived so long behind duty that when I am finally seen, there will be nothing worth the seeing. He allowed the confession to stand. You return my tokens because you will not be reduced. I respect that. Silence settled, not empty but inhabited. Eleanor felt the room's attention narrow to the space between their breaths. Then why ask me here, she said, not accusing, simply seeking the truth that had brought her across a city disciplined by rumor. Because restraint has begun to lie, he answered. And because I would rather be precise with you than generous with the city. He did not reach for her. He held himself where he was. I will not protect you by erasing you. If you wish me gone from your days, say it, and I will make it so. The offer startled her more than any gift. Power, when it bends to permission, becomes something else entirely. She felt the careful architecture of her solitude shift. Do not withdraw, she said, and the words surprised her with their certainty. Withdrawals leave vacuums. Vacuums are filled by louder lies. His gaze sharpened, not with triumph, but with recognition of a shared risk. Then allow me to be exact, he said. I cannot promise safety. I can promise attention. He searched her face. And choice. Eleanor stepped closer, one measured pace that felt like crossing a border she had drawn for years. I will not be hidden, she said, nor displayed. Nor will you be, he replied, and for the first time, warmth threaded his voice. I have ruled estates and answered to crowns, he said, quietly, yet it is your silence that undoes me. The admission hung between them, fragile and irrevocable. Outside, the fog thinned. Eleanor felt the future press in, not as certainty but as invitation. When the door opened behind her, summoned by a discreet knock, she did not turn at once. Raven's Hollow did not move to stop her. He did not need to. The fire popped once, as if marking time, and Eleanor understood that whatever followed would not be undone by apologies, for the city remembered gestures longer than intentions, and power punished hesitation with relentless, immaculate efficiency alone now. As she reached for the handle, he spoke again, not loudly, but with the authority of a man who had decided something dangerous. Tomorrow, he said, I will be seen choosing. She paused, her hand warm on the brass, and understood that the scandal had just acquired a voice. The ballroom at Ashcombe House burned with a controlled splendor, chandeliers dripping light like molten crystal, mirrors multiplying every gesture into consequence. Music lifted and fell with the discipline of a heart trained to endure, while gowns whispered across the floor in tides of silk and intention. Eleanor entered with measured calm, her bearing composed into something that could pass for indifference if one did not look too closely. She had chosen simplicity against the room's excess, a quiet defiance that drew attention precisely because it refused to ask for it. The city had gathered to witness order reassert itself. The princess stood near the dais, luminous and immaculate, her presence smoothing the air into certainty. She smiled as one smiles at inevitability. Around her, allies murmured, enemies observed, and wagers were silently placed. Eleanor felt the pressure of anticipation like a hand at her back. She knew she was expected to falter, to be revealed as a mistake briefly entertained. She would not provide the pleasure. When the Duke arrived, conversation shifted as if guided by a single will. He moved through the room with deliberate pace, acknowledging greetings without surrendering momentum. His eyes found Eleanor once, briefly, and held. There was no reassurance in the look, only recognition of a shared undertaking whose outcome could not be softened. The orchestra paused. Glasses were lifted. The moment presented itself with ceremonial patience. It came not as an announcement but as an interruption. A voice, confident and cutting, carried across the floor, naming impropriety with the precision of a blade honed for public use. The accusation was elegant, almost kind, and entirely lethal. Eleanor felt the room turn toward her, the heat of attention scalding. She stood still, refusing to shrink, her pulse loud in her ears. Shame reached for her and found no purchase. Before silence could curdle into judgment, Ravenshollow stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at the accuser. He addressed the room as if addressing history. "There will be no more speculation," he said, and the music of authority threaded the space. "What I choose to make known, I will make known myself." The princess's smile did not waver, but her eyes sharpened. Eleanor felt the distance between her and the Duke compress, not physically, but irrevocably. He turned then, not toward the dais, but toward Eleanor, and the choice resounded louder than any declaration. "Miss Hale," he said, her name placed carefully into the room's memory. "You stand accused by implication. I reject it." A murmur rose, swift and startled. He continued, composed and devastating. "I have extended regard where it was deserved and restraint where it was required. I will not permit either to be recast as transgression." He paused, letting the words settle. "If my conduct is to be questioned, let it be questioned openly, and let the answers be mine." Eleanor felt a tremor move through her, not fear, but relief edged with awe. The princess stepped forward at last, her voice calm, her authority unassailable. "Your obligations are known," she said, gently. "Your position is not yours alone." Ravenshollow inclined his head. "I am aware," he replied. "And I am accountable." He faced her fully now. "Which is why I will be precise." He turned back to the room. "My engagement has served its purpose. It will not serve as a muzzle." The shock landed like glass breaking in winter. Alliances recalculated themselves in the space of a breath. Eleanor understood the cost even as she felt the warmth of being claimed without possession. The Duke did not reach for her. He did not soften the blow. He allowed consequence to stand. The accuser faltered. Others found their voices and lost them again. The princess regarded Eleanor with a look that held no cruelty, only the clarity of a woman who had mistaken certainty for permanence. "Then you choose," she said quietly. "I do," he answered. "I choose to be exact." The orchestra resumed, tentatively, as if testing the room's ability to hold sound. Eleanor remained where she was, the floor steady beneath her feet. She felt suddenly visible in a way that did not diminish her. The Duke's enemies watched with narrowed eyes, already measuring reprisals. The city inhaled, savoring the promise of aftermath. When the Duke offered his arm, it was not as refuge but as acknowledgment. Eleanor took it, not to be displayed, but to stand beside him as the room recalibrated its understanding of power. They moved together through the crowd, neither hurried nor triumphant, leaving behind a wake of recalculation and quiet fury. At the threshold, he stopped. "What follows will not be gentle," he said, low enough that only she could hear. Eleanor met his gaze, steady. "Neither am I," she replied. They stepped into the night, where rain waited like a witness, and behind them the ballroom rearranged its loyalties. Somewhere, a message was already being written, and Eleanor felt the future gather itself, poised to demand its due. The consequences arrived with the Morning Post, crisp and unemotional as ledgers. Letters bore seals that had once opened doors and now closed them with finality. Ravenshollow read them without haste, standing at the tall window where light fell cleanly, as if determined to tell the truth. Titles were suspended, invitations withdrawn, favors recalculated into absence. Power did not shout when it punished, it corrected the record. He accepted each correction with the same composure that had governed his declaration, placing the papers aside as one might place down weapons no longer needed. Eleanor learned of the cost before she learned of his response. The city's murmurs sharpened into instruction. A friend, pale with concern, advised departure, speaking of safety in distance and dignity preserved through disappearance. Eleanor listened and thanked her, then returned to her room and began to pack. She folded dresses that had never been noticed and letters she had never answered, preparing to restore the quiet that had once protected her. She would not be the reason a man lost what he had built. Love, if that was what this was becoming, did not require spectacle to prove itself honorable. When Ravenshollow came to her, it was without retinue, without urgency, as if the day had been waiting for this meeting. He found her among open trunks, her hands steady, her resolve already arranged. "You intend to go," he said, not accusing, simply reading the facts she had placed before him. "I intend to remove myself from the arithmetic," she replied. "Your losses are already tallied. I will not add my name to the column." He closed the door and leaned against it, a gesture so human it startled them both. "You mistake subtraction for mercy," he said. "What is being taken from me was never mine without condition." He crossed the room and stopped before her, careful, deliberate. "I will not accept a virtue that costs me the truth." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw fatigue etched beneath resolve, the price of having spoken plainly to a world that preferred euphemism. "They will not forgive you," she said. "I am not asking to be forgiven," he answered. "I am choosing to be exact." He took her hands, finally, not as claim but as promise. "If you leave, you will confirm their narrative. If you stay, you will force a new one." The weight of choice pressed in, heavy and luminous. Eleanor felt the old instinct to retreat, to preserve dignity through absence, falter under the steadier demand of presence. "I will not be paraded," she said. "Nor will you be," he replied. "Stand with me. Let them adjust." The reckoning came swiftly. A council convened with the efficiency of offended order. Ravenshollow answered questions with patience and refused compromises with the same courtesy. He relinquished what could not be held without apology. In return, he demanded nothing but the freedom to live uncoached. When the final letter was signed, the room felt smaller, as if power had stepped aside to see what would happen next. They left London at dawn, not in flight but in refusal. The carriage wheels cut clean tracks through wet streets, and Eleanor watched the city recede, not as exile but as shedding. At the country estate that remained unencumbered by favor, the air smelled of rain and leaf mold, honest and unadorned. Ravenshollow walked the grounds with her, naming what would change and what would not. He spoke of labor and repair, of days that would not glitter, of nights that would require faith rather than applause. In the weeks that followed, enemies tested the perimeter and found it guarded by indifference. Without scandal to feed upon, rumor starved. The princess married elsewhere, gracefully, and was remembered kindly. The city discovered a new spectacle. Eleanor learned the estate's rhythms and found dignity not diminished by work. She spoke when she chose and was heard without translation. On an evening burnished by sunset, Ravenshollow knelt in the grass, not to plead but to align himself with her line of sight. "I have nothing left to offer you but what is mine without permission," he said. "My name, diminished. My future, uncertain. My attention, undivided." Eleanor felt the past loosen its grip. She thought of rain on stone, of shawls returned, of silence that had once been her armor. She knelt with him, so they met as equals. "Then take what remains of me," she said, steady and bright, "and we will make it sufficient." They stood together as night settled, the house behind them warm with lamplight, the world ahead unpromised and therefore honest. History would remember the Duke for what he surrendered. She would remember him for the moment he chose to kneel, not to a crown, but to her worth.